You keep playing stuff like that, Natan, and I'll never want to start the service. Shabbat Shalom, everyone. Welcome to Congregation Beth Ahabah. We're so glad that you're here. My name is Cantor Sarah Beck-Berman, and I'm filling in also tonight for Rabbi Scott Nagel, who's not here tonight. During our service, we'll be using the Mishkan Tefillah prayer book, and a link to a digital flip book version of that prayer book was provided to people in the links email that went out to our membership at 4:30 this afternoon. As we move through the service tonight, the organization of our prayer book tends to be in a 2-page layout. So when I announce a page number, of course, I'll do my best to announce every page number. But if we come to the end of one page, we might move on to the left-hand side page, or we might move on to the very next page in the book as well. On the right-hand side of the page tends to be Hebrew, transliteration of the Hebrew into English characters, and a translation of the Hebrew into English. On the left-hand side of the page tends to be additional prayers, poems, and other readings along the same theme as the prayer on the right-hand side. And so I encourage you all to read, sing, pray, whatever is comfortable and most meaningful for you during our service tonight. Our Siddur is Hebrew style and thus reads from right to left. If you have a printed book, it also reads from right to left. If you have a Kindle, it might be a little bit different. I encourage all of you to rise or remain seated as is comfortable for you where you are. I will announce all of those typical service cues, and you will do whatever is possible and comfortable for you. Joining me tonight is Natan Berenstein, our music director at the piano, and also Heather Dinkin, who is helping keep an eye on the stream and making sure that everything is working properly. Speaking of which, I'm hoping that my voice is coming through at a reasonable volume. Great, because it's a microphone I'm not used to using. We will open our service tonight with Lecha Dodi, a famous piyut, a famous liturgical poem. On page 20, we will be singing verses 1, 2, and then skipping over to verse 9. And when we reach the chorus in between verse 2 and verse 9, I'll motion everyone to please rise as we have this custom when we come to the last verse of Lecha Dodi, that we all rise and face the entrance of whatever room or house that we're in to greet the Sabbath bride. So Lecha Dodi on page 20.
Ishme'anu el ha'miuchad, Adonai
before we move on with our service, I'll point out one quick fun fact about Lecha Dodi, which is, if you look at the first letter of each of the first 8 verses, the first letter of each verse spells out the name of the composer, who I might be mentioning briefly in my sermon later, so that might be why I'm pointing out this fun fact. And that name is Shlomo for 1 through 4, and Halevi from 5 through 8. That's what the first letter of each verse spells out. As we bring Shabbat into our midst, as the time crosses over and we draw nearer to the evening when the sun sinks below the horizon and Shabbat begins, we mark this distinction, this separation between regular everyday time and sacred holy Shabbat time a few ways. And several of those ways are by lighting candles and by making the kiddush, the special blessing over wine or grape juice for Shabbat. So I invite you now to get your candlesticks and your kiddush cups ready if you have them, and to turn to page 2 in our prayer book, page 2. First, we'll light the candles together, and then we will recite the blessing. Together, Baruch Atah Adonai, Eloheinu melech haolam, asher kiddushanu b'mitzvotav, v'tzivanu lahadlik ner shel Shabbat. Blessed are you, Adonai our God, sovereign of the universe, who hallows us with mitzvot, commanding us to kindle the light of Shabbat. Baruch Atah we turn to page 5 for the kiddush, and we lift our cups together. Baruch atah Adonai Eloheinu melech haolam, borei peri hagafen. Baruch atah Adonai Eloheinu melech haolam, asher kiddushanu b'mitzvotav v'ratzavanu b'shabbat kodsho b'ahava uvratzon hinchilanu zikaron lemasei v'reishit ki hu yom techila lemikrai kodesh zecher litziat Mitzrayim ki vanu v'acharta v'otanu kidashta mikol ha'amim v'shabbat kodshecha be'ava uvratzon hinchaltanu. Baruch atah Adonai mekadesh haShabbat. Amen. L'chaim. Tasty grape juice. And now that we have welcomed Shabbat into our midst, we come together as a congregation to pray together apart. And on page 28, Page 28, I invite everyone to please rise for our call to worship together as a congregation, the Baruch Hu. And as we turn to our prayer for the evening sky, page 31 in the middle of the page, before we say the prayer for the evening, I ask my customary question: what phase is the moon in? And the answer is, for those of you following along on the Jewish calendar, the Hebrew calendar, tonight and tomorrow is the 4th of the month of Sivan. And since we're so close to the beginning of the month, that can only mean that we've just had a new moon, which we did. The new moon, Rosh Chodesh, the beginning of Sivan, was on Tuesday. So the phase of the moon that we're in now would be a waxing crescent moon, the little crescent that gets bigger and bigger. Let's say together on page 31 our prayer for the evening in the middle of the page. This is an hour of change. Within it, we stand uncertain on the border of light. Shall we draw back or cross over? Where shall our hearts turn? Shall we draw back, my brother, my sister, or cross over? This is the hour of change, and within it we stand quietly on the border of light. What lies before us? Shall we draw back, my brother, my sister, or cross over? Baruch atah Adonai, hama'ariv aravim. We turn to page 34, and we remain standing as we prepare for the Shema. Hear, O Israel, Adonai is our God, Adonai is one. We continue with the Via Hafta on page 36. Ve'ahavta et Adonai Elohecha v'chol levavcha uv'chol nafshecha uv'chol me'odecha. And you may also be seated. Ve'hayu hadvarim ha'ele asher anochi mitzavecha hayom על לבביך, ושיננתם לבניך, ודיברת בם, בשבתך בביתך, ובלכתך בדרך, ושוכבך ובקומך, וקשרתם לאות על ידיך, והיו לטוטפות בין עיניך, וכתבתם על מזוזות ביתך ובישעריך, למען תזכרו ועשיתם את כל מצוותי, והייתם קדושים לאלוהיכם. אני אדוני אלוהיכם, אשר הוצאתי אתכם מארץ מצרים, להיות לכם לאלוהים. אני אדוני אלוהיכם, אדוני אלוהיכם אמת. We continue on page 40 with our song of freedom, Mi Chamocha. We continue on page 42 with the Jewish bedtime prayer, the Hashkivenu, on page 42. We continue on page 44 as we celebrate, keyword celebrate, Vishamru at the top of the page.
Shabbat lasod et ha-Shabbat ledorotam berit olam v'shameru b'nei Yisrael et ha-Shabbat lasod et ha-Shabbat ledorotam berit olam beini uven b'nei Yisrael od leolam Kishet Yamim, As Adonai, Adonai, V'shameru b'nei Yisrael, et ha-Shabbat lasod et ha-Shabbat ledorotam berit olam, V'shameru b'nei Yisrael, ha-Shabbat lasod et ha-Shabbat ledorotam berit olam et ha-shamayim ve'et haaretz uvayom ha-shevi'i Shabbat ba'i nafash v'shameru b'nei Yisrael et ha-Shabbat lasod et ha-Shabbat ledorotam berit olam v'shameru b'nei Yisrael et ha-Shabbat lasod et ha-Shabbat ledorotam berit olam.
We come now to the central portion of our service called the Amidah, the standing prayer, or the Tefillah, the quintessential prayer, which begins on page 46 and continues across the next several pages, so don't be surprised that it keeps going. We begin, however, on page 46. Please rise.
Baruch atah Adonai, Eloheinu, v'Elohei Avoteinu v'Imotenu, Elohei Avraham, Elohei Yitzchak, v'Elohei Yaakov, Elohei Sarah, Elohei Rivka, Elohei Rachel, v'Elohei Leah, Ha'el Hagadol, Hagibur v'Hanorah, El Elyon, Gomel Chasadim Tovim, Vekonei Hakol, V'Zocher Chastei Avot V'Imahot, U'mevii Geula Livnei Bneihem, Le'man Shemo Be'ahava, Melech Ozer U'Moshia U'Magen, Baruch atah Adonai, Magen Avraham ve'ezrat Sarah. Atah gibor leolam Adonai, Mechayei hakol atah, Rav lehoshia, Morid hatal. Mechalkel chaim bechesed, Mechayei hakol berachamim rabim, Somech noflim verofei cholim, Umatir asurim, Umkayem emunato lishenei afar, Michamocha bal gevurot, Umido melach, melech memit umchaye, umatzmiach Yeshua, v'ne'eman atal hachayot hakol, Baruch atah Adonai, mechayei hakol. Atah kadosh v'shimcha kadosh, ukdoshim b'chol yom yehalelucha selah. Baruch atah Adonai, ha'el hakadosh.
You may be seated. We continue reading at the top of page 55. May these hours of rest and renewal open our hearts to joy and our minds to truth. May all who struggle find rest on this day. May all who suffer find solace. May all who hurt find healing on this day. May all who despair find purpose. May all who hunger find fulfillment on this day, and may this day fulfill its promise. Baruch atah Adonai, Mekadesh HaShabbat. We continue on page 60, with one of our prayers for peace, Shalom Rav.
Shalom Rav al Yisrael, Amechot hasim leolam, Ki atah hu melech adon, lechol hashalom. Shalom Rav al Yisrael, Amechot hasim leolam, Ki atah hu melech adon, lechol hashalom. וטוב בעיניך לברך את עמך ישראל בכל עת ובכל שעה בשלומך. וטוב בעיניך לברך את עמך ישראל בכל עת ובכל שעה בשלומך. שלום רב על ישראל, הנחת תשים לעולם, כי אתה הוא מלך אדון, לכל השלום. ברוך אתה אדוני, המברך את עמו ישראל
We continue silently in silent prayer, reflection, or meditation. We'll come back together at the bottom of page 62 with the Oseh Shalom. So you're welcome to use the words on the page or the words that are in your heart. continue with Ose Shalom, a prayer for peace at the bottom of page 62.
Shalom, shalom, b'namav, uyaseh shalom, shalom aleinu, ve'al, ve'al, ve'al kol Yisrael, ve'al kol Yoshvei Tevel, Leratzon, Leratzon, in Levi,
We take a moment at this time in our service to think about those people in need of healing. Healing of body, healing of mind, healing of spirit. And we turn to page 253. Page 253 in our prayer books. As we prepare for the Mishaberach for healing, I ask those of you who are in need of healing yourselves, who are thinking of someone, to share all of those names at this time. Beth Ahabah is praying for the healing of Rory Waldman and Mira Shoshana Bat Avram Visara. We pray for their healing, and we pray for everyone in our world who needs healing as we turn to the Mishaberach on page 253.
Mishaberach Avotenu, Avraham, Yitzchak, veYaakov. Mishaberach Imotenu, Sarah, Rivka, Leah, veRachel. May the one who blessed our mothers, may the one who blessed our fathers, hear our prayer, hear our prayer, hear our prayer, hear our prayer, and bless us as well. Mishaberach Avotenu, Mishaberach Imotenu, hear our prayer, hear our prayer, hear our prayer, hear our prayer, and bless us as well. Hear our prayer, hear our prayer, hear our prayer, hear our prayer, and bless us as well.
Amen. This week's Torah portion is called B'midbar. It is the first Torah portion in the book of Numbers. However, I will not be talking about the Torah portion in my sermon this week. Instead, I want to talk about the holiday that Rabbi Byfield once called the Rodney Dangerfield of Jewish holidays. I guess Shavuot don't get no respect. So I would like to share with you some gleanings about, no pun intended, about the holiday of Shavuot, and hopefully even those of you who know something about Shavuot will learn something you didn't know before, because one of the themes of this holiday is learning. In fact, if I had to kind of distill Shavuot, the holiday, down to certain themes, those themes could be Torah, the revelation of Torah at Sinai, learning, kindness, and we'll find out why in a few minutes, as well as harvest and the bounty of the land and gratitude. Those are all potential themes of the holiday of Shavuot. Shavuot is the 6th of Sivan in our Jewish calendar, which also happens to be 50 days after the second night of Pesach, of Passover. Shavuot is considered a major festival. It's one of the 3 pilgrimage festivals in ancient Israel. People would go on a pilgrimage, thus the name pilgrimage festivals, to Jerusalem 3 times a year for Passover, for Shavuot 50 days later, and then in the fall for Sukkot. A major festival means that we would light candles, we would make kiddush, and traditionally we would also avoid most forms of work, although we would still be able to cook things, and it's not quite as restrictive in those rules as it is for the Sabbath. We do this to demarcate between regular everyday time and sacred time, very similarly to how we welcome Shabbat by lighting candles and saying the Shabbat Kiddush. We would do the same thing on Shavuot. The rules about what kind of work we're allowed to do are a little stricter on Shabbat because Shabbat is a day of full and complete rest. Now, I've been calling this holiday Shavuot, but in fact, it has several different names. Festival of Weeks, that's what Shavuot means. Festival of Harvest, Day of First Fruits, the time of the giving of the Torah. Where do all these names come from, and what do they mean? Well, first let's talk about Chag HaShavuot, which means the festival or feast of the weeks. This comes from Exodus chapter 34, verse 22. That's where that name comes from. I've seen both festival of weeks and feast of weeks in English. Chag, we probably think of as meaning holiday, which is really also what it means. Like when we say Chag Sameach, happy holiday. Shavuah in Hebrew means week, and Shavuot means weeks, plural weeks. This refers to how we arrive at the holiday by counting 7 weeks of 7 days from Passover. Simple enough, right? So, Festival of Harvest, Chag HaKatzir, which also comes from Exodus chapter 23, verse 16. Shavuot is connected in the biblical text to the season of the grain harvest, specifically the wheat harvest in the land of Israel. This is also building on the previous name of Chag HaShavuot, the Festival of Weeks, because the ancient grain harvest began with the harvesting of barley during Passover and ended with the harvesting of wheat at Shavuot. And that lasted how many weeks? Yes, you guessed it, 7 weeks. So if Passover was the beginning festival that kicked off the grain harvest, then Shavuot was the concluding festival for the grain harvest, the last of the 3 pilgrimage festivals in the year, since we would start the count with Sukkot in the fall, since that's after the new year of Rosh Hashanah. Well, really no air quotes, it is actually the new year. Now, Sukkot is the conclusion of the fruit harvest. So all of these pilgrimage festivals are associated with harvests. When there was a temple in Jerusalem, people for Shavuot would bring offerings of bread from the wheat harvest. But that wasn't all that they brought. It brings us to our next name, Yom HaBikurim, Day of the First Fruits. from Numbers chapter 28, verse 26. And some of these names are also referenced elsewhere in the biblical text too, but this is one place where that name is referenced. Shavuot is referred to as this day of the first fruits, which refers to a practice in temple times when those that could would take offerings of the first fruits of their harvest, place them in fancy baskets, and bring them to the temple in Jerusalem in this great parade. Often there would be decorations of flowers as well. And at the temple in Jerusalem, each farmer would present their first fruits to a priest, a Kohen, in a ceremony which follows the text of Deuteronomy chapter 26, verses 1 through 10. So if you're curious to read that whole section, you can look it up. It's Deuteronomy chapter 26, verses 1 through 10. And that includes the lines that some of us may recognize from the Passover Haggadah. My father was a wandering Aramean, and he went down into Egypt and sojourned there, few in number, and he became there a nation, great, mighty, and populous, etc., etc. These verses briefly recall the story of the Exodus, tying the people's gratitude for the Exodus and for that being saved by God in the Exodus with their gratitude for the bounty of the land and the harvest in the promised land that God brought them to after the Exodus. But wait, there's more. There's one name we have not yet discussed. The rabbis call Shavuot Zman Matan Toratenu, which means the time of the giving of our Torah. And you'll hear us say Zman Matan Toratenu when we say the Kiddush on Shavuot, on Sunday night. This name does not appear in the biblical text. Rather, it comes from a rabbinic tradition about the festival of Shavuot. The rabbis calculated that the revelation at Sinai, the thunder, the lightning, I am Adonai your God, the commandments, etc., all of this happened, the rabbis say, on the 6th of Sivan, which we now know is Shavuot. So from this rabbinic calculation, we have this notion that the revelation at Sinai and the associated giving of the Torah happened at Shavuot and is connected to Shavuot because that's when it happened. We even have a special festival reading from the Torah that we do on Shavuot, which is Exodus, beginning in chapter 19, verse 1, and going all the way until the end of chapter 20, which includes the revelation at Sinai and the Ten Commandments. There's also a secondary Torah reading that many synagogues do from Numbers chapter 28, verses 26 through 31, and these verses describe the Shavuot offerings that would have been made in the temple. So those are the names of Shavuot. So let's talk about a few traditions. What do people do on Shavuot? This has varied somewhat over the centuries. The first big one I think most people think of is the Tikkun Leil Shavuot, the all-night Torah study. You stay up all night on the eve of Shavuot until the next morning studying Torah. This practice is called Tikkun Leil Shavuot, which is difficult to translate literally. Tikkun means something like improvement, fixing or improvement. So we're like improving Shavuot night or fixing it. So this name and practice is somewhat connected to a midrash, which is like a fan fiction on the Torah, stories about the Torah that the rabbis tell. And this midrash relates that the night before the Torah was given, the Israelites retired early to be well rested for the incredible day that they had ahead of them. However, they overslept. Their alarm clocks didn't go off, and Moses had to wake them up because God was waiting for them on the mountaintop and they were nowhere to be seen. So to rectify this flaw in the national character, so to speak, many religious Jews stay up all night to learn Torah. So that's very nice, of course, but the custom of staying up all night to study Torah goes back to slightly less ancient times than that. In the 16th century, Rabbi Yosef Karo, who's the author of a very famous book on Jewish law called the Shulchan Aruch, which means the set table. Now, this Rabbi Yosef Karo invited Rabbi Shlomo Halevi Alkabetz, Shlomo Halevi, like the author of Lecha Dodi that we sang at the beginning of the service. The rabbi got invited to his house, and he invited other Kabbalists as well, because they were all students of Kabbalah, of Jewish mysticism, and they were all invited to a study vigil on Shavuot. They prepared for 3 days before their study session, just like the Israelites did, prepared for 3 days before the revelation at Sinai. Pretty cool. There's a couple of liturgical things that are associated with Shavuot, special prayers done only on Shavuot. Ashkenazim recite a piyut. A piyut is a liturgical poem, and it's an Aramaic piyut called akdamut. They recite this before the Torah is read during the morning service of Shavuot. It's an acrostic poem on the themes of God, Torah, and Israel. Pretty appropriate for that holiday. And there's a lot of biblical and Talmudic references all throughout that big poem. And the traditional melody for that poem is the one that we use to sing the Kiddush on festivals and Shavuot, that melody that's become frequently used to sing the Kiddush for festivals. That's the traditional tune for Akdamut. That's what the tradition is, to use this melody. And since Akdamut is not done everywhere, some of you may never have heard it before, people have taken that melody and used it for the festival Kiddush at all 3 pilgrimage festivals, actually. Sephardi Jews do not read Akdamut, but they do different piyutim, liturgical poems, called azharot, and those set out the 613 commandments. And there's various traditions about the positive ones and the negative ones, and you do the positives one here and the negative ones there, and so forth. Another really big thing we do on Shavuot is reading the book of Ruth. And this is where kindness comes in. Because the book of Ruth, although it's traditionally read on Shavuot, there's no consensus as to exactly why it's read on Shavuot. One of the themes of the book of Ruth, however, is kindness. Because of the kindness that Ruth shows her mother-in-law and the kindness that is shown to her by Boaz later in the story. It's the idea that kindness rewards kindness. A few of the possible answers for why we read Ruth on Shavuot is Shavuot is a harvest festival, and much of the book of Ruth takes place during harvesting. Also, King David is the great-grandson of Ruth, and he is supposed to have been born and died on Shavuot, so there's a family connection there. For those fans of gematria, of Jewish numerology, the name Ruth in Hebrew, Ruth, in gematria, in numerology, is 606, which, if you add 7 for the 7 Noahide laws, it brings you to 613, the number of commandments given in the Torah at Sinai. To me, that's a bit of a stretch, but some people are like super into their gematria. I'll give you one more. Shavuot, as we know, is the day that we celebrate the giving of the Torah, and that means the entire Jewish people entered into a brit, or a covenant, with God that day. Ruth is widely considered the quintessential convert to Judaism, and her joining of the Jewish people, joining the tribe, really fits this theme of entering into the covenant. I would be remiss if I did not mention eating dairy products. We like dairy products. This is not ubiquitous among every single Jewish population, but there are a lot of different Jewish subcultures that eat dairy on Shavuot. Ashkenazi Jews, Syrian Jews, Iraqi Jews, Tunisian and Moroccan. However, Yemenite Jews do not eat dairy foods on Shavuot. There are many possible explanations for why this is. Some of them are a little wacky. I'll only give you a few. Here's a gematria one again. The numerological equivalent of the Hebrew word for milk, chalav, is 40, corresponding to the 40 days and 40 nights that Moses spent on Mount Sinai before bringing down the Torah. By that logic, of course, we should also eat milk on the weekend that we read the portion of Noah, since the flood lasted for 40 days, but that's okay. The Psalms This is another possible reason that we eat dairy. The Psalms call Mount Sinai Har Hagavnunim, the mountain of majestic peaks. And that is etymologically similar to the word givina, which means cheese. That one makes me laugh. The Torah is also compared to milk by King Solomon in Song of Songs, chapter 4, verse 11. Like honey and milk, it lies under your tongue. So those are a couple of possible reasons. But as with Ruth, there's no definitive one. Last, but certainly not least, we have the practice of decorating our homes and decorating our synagogues with greenery for Shavuot. I will mention this, just a few reasons for this custom. There's a midrash, another one of those stories about the Torah stories, that in anticipation of the revelation of Torah, Mount Sinai suddenly bloomed with flowers. Baby Moses was supposedly placed into the river. This is a separate reason. Baby Moses was supposedly placed into the river on the 6th of Sivan, which, as we now know, is Shavuot. He was placed into the river in a basket made of bulrushes and hidden amongst the river reeds, and so that greenery and him being in the basket on Shavuot, it's a whole thing. Now, some places also would like to decorate the bima with flowers and plants as if it's a chuppah, a bridal canopy, which refers to the Jewish mystical image of the covenant between God and Israel being like a marriage covenant, with God as the groom and the nation of Israel as the bride. And there are even some communities that read out a ketubah, as it were, a marriage contract between God and Israel, which was composed by a famous Eastern Sephardi rabbi, or maybe just Sephardi, Rabbi Israel ben Moses Najara. So I hope that you've learned something about Shavuot. For more resources about Shavuot, including recipes, family activities, and songs, you can see our website, our Omer and Shavuot resources page on our website, which is bethahabah.org/Omer, O-M-E-R, -resources. And of course, I would be remiss if I did not mention that voting is open until 9 a.m. tomorrow for the last of our Omer Madness study matchups before the championship. So tonight until 9 a.m., you can get in your final four vote. The very last Omer Madness vote, the championship vote for the last two texts standing, will go out tomorrow at noon. Voting will close at 9 a.m. on Sunday morning, and we will send an announcement on Sunday at noon, along with the link by which you can access our Zoom Shavuot service that night at 6:15 on Sunday night, which we will not only be celebrating Shavuot, we'll also be celebrating our confirmands for 2021. Whew. It's been a whirlwind few weeks of daily text study, and the rabbi and I hope that you've enjoyed it. As always, if you have questions or comments about any of those texts, we would love to hear from you. Shoot us an email. And if you want to look back at past texts and past votes, all of that can be found linked from our Omer resources page. And finally, a blessing. May this Shabbat, this day of rest, inspire us to do the inner work that helps us remain curious about what we do not know, rather than stuck in an attitude of certitude. May we always hold on to that spark of excitement at learning something new. May love of Torah and loving kindness for our world fill our hearts. Amen, and Shabbat Shalom. We return to our Sidurim on page 278. As we count the Omer. We are very close, but we haven't finished counting the Omer yet. We'll finish counting the Omer on Saturday night, as a matter of fact. So on page 278, where it says, I am ready, let's read together. I am ready to fulfill the mitzvah of counting the Omer. Baruch atah Adonai Eloheinu melech haolam, Asher kideshanu b'mitzvotav v'tzivanu al sefirat ha'omer. Our praise to you, Adonai, sovereign of all, who hallows us with mitzvot, commanding us to count the Omer. Hayom shmona v'arba'im yom, shehem shisha shavuot v'shisha yamim la'omer, which means tonight is the 48th day of the Omer. The 48th day begins tonight, which is 6 weeks and 6 days of the Omer. 48, we're almost there. Just one more to the 49th day, and then one more day until Shavuot. We turn to page 282 as I open the ark for the Aleinu. I invite everyone to rise. The Aleinu begins in the middle of page 282 and then continues on page 287. Please rise.
Aleinu l'shabeach l'adon hakol, לתת גדולה ליוצא בראשית, שלא עשנו כגויי הארצות, ולא שמנו כמשפחות האדמה, שלא שם חלקנו כהם, וגורלנו ככל המונם, ואנחנו קוראים ומשתחווים ומודים לפני מלך מלכי המלכים הקדוש ברוך הוא. ונאמר והיה אדוני למלך על כל הארץ ביום ההוא יהיה אדוני אחד ושמו אחד.
You may be seated. At this time in our service, we think about those who are no longer with us, those who have passed away. And I invite you, as we turn to page 294 for the Mourner's Kaddish, to think about those people in your life whom you've lost and who you miss. Beth Ahabah recalls the recent passings of Edward Marks, Hector Oswaldo Chueca Salamanca, David Schreibfetter, David Sporn, and Stanley Saul Brager. We also mark the Yartzites, the anniversary of passing of the following people: Edward B. Andrews, Ethel Atkins, Helen Baum, Joel M. Berkelhammer, Robert D. Binder, Marjorie Lee Blanton, Amy Golda Breath, Shirley Brownstein, Joseph Burlock, Miriam R. Cohen, Adeline W. Cohen, Helen Cohen, Mr. Abe Cohn, Elaine Dobrinsky, Anthony Frank, Harry A. Glasser, Gertrude Goodman, Joseph Henry Hodes, Blanche F. Hoffman, Sam Kornblau, David Coleman, Miriam Lipton, H. Jack Lopater, Francis L. Malloy, Rena M. Markoff, Andrew Hirsch Marks, Jake Mast, Rosalind Nagel, Walter Davis Nelson Jr., Gerald Arnold Pickus, Bill Roshberg, Harold Edwin Rosenberg, Babette S. Rosenheim, Francis Hirschberg Rubenstein, Celia S. Snyder, Isaac Sternheimer, Minnie Block Sickle, Reuben Viner, Blanche Weinstein, and Dr. Bennett Weissglass. And if any of you are in Shiva, the 7-day period of mourning following a loved one's death, in Shloshim, the 30-day period following a loved one's death, if it's the yard site, the anniversary of passing for someone that you know, or if you'd simply like to remember someone on this occasion of this Shabbat, please share their names with us out loud where you are, in the chat, in your heart, whatever's comfortable for you. As we turn to the Mourner's Kaddish together on page 294, I invite those who are observing Shiva to rise, those who are observing Shloshim to rise. And as is our custom here at Beth Ahabah, the whole congregation, the whole community to rise together in support of one another as we recite the Mourner's Kaddish on page 294. Yit Gadal v'yit Kadash Shemei Rabbah Be'alma Divra Chirute V'yamlich Malchute B'chayechon Uv'yomechon Uv'chaye D'chol Beit Yisrael Ba'agala Uv'izman Kariv V'imru. Amen. Yehi Shemei Rabbah Mevarach Le'alam Ul'almei Almaya Yitbarach V'yishtabach V'yitpa'ar V'yitromam V'yitnaseh V'yithadar V'yit'aleh V'yithalal Shemei D'Kudesha B'richu Le'ela min kol birchata v'shirata, tush bechata v'nechemata, da'amiran ba'alma v'imru. Amen. Yehi shalama rabba min shemaya, v'chayim aleinu v'al kol Yisrael v'imru. Amen. Oseh shalom bimromav. Hu ya'aseh shalom aleinu v'al kol Yisrael v'imru. Amen. Yehi zichronam livracha. May their memories always be a blessing. And let us say, Amen. You may be seated. Things are starting to wind down as we move towards summer, but there's still some stuff to keep your eye open for. Omer Madness, as I said at the end of my sermon, is not quite over yet, so keep your eye on your inbox to finish out our Omer Madness text study. On Sunday night, we celebrate Shavuot and the 2021 confirmation class. That will be at 6:15 p.m. on Zoom, and that link will go out to our congregants at noon on Sunday. On Tuesday, May 18th at 7 p.m., women of Beth Ahabah have an open meeting for everyone to come and learn about what women of Beth Ahabah have been up to and to start some hopeful and optimistic planning for the future. You can get to the Zoom link for that meeting in our e-news email bulletins. Next week, next Friday night, all members of Beth Ahabah, please join us for our annual meeting at 5:30 p.m. on Zoom. It will be followed by Shabbat services, which will be on our YouTube channel at 6:15, including the installation of the new officers and board. But please do join us for our annual meeting before that service on Zoom at 5:30. On Saturday, May 22nd at 9 a.m., we have a Tot Shabbat service for families with tiny people under the age of 5. And at 12:30 p.m., there's a Talmud Lunch and Learn for scholars of all ages. Both of those programs will be run by Rabbi Nagel, I believe, from the Nagel household. Streaming live from the Nagel household. And both of those are also, I believe, on Zoom, and the links to those things can be found in the e-news. Watch your inboxes for a survey that will be forthcoming sometime in the near future about High Holy Days, and for those of you with religious school age students, a survey about religious school for the fall. We want to hear from you. We want to know what your thoughts are on certain things, and so we are sending out some surveys. Before we conclude our service, a blessing. More blessings. You can never have too many blessings. So gather your families close and think about those of your families that you don't have around you right now. And we say, Yisameach Elohim kesara Rivka Rachel v'Leah, and Yisimcha Elohim ke'Ephraim v'Chimnashe. May God inspire you to live like Sarah, Rebecca, Rachel, and Leah, and Ephraim and Menashe, who led forth our people in strength. And for everyone, Yivarechecha Adonai v'Yishmerecha, Ya'er Adonai panav elecha v'yichuneka, Yisa Adonai panav elecha v'yasem lecha. Shalom. May God bless you and keep you. May God be with you in everything that you do. And may God grant you nothing but health, strength, and peace. Amen, amen, amen. May we all be blessed in the coming week with health, strength, and peace. Our concluding piyut, our concluding liturgical poem tonight, is Adon Olam on page 321. Page 321. And this is a tune that comes from the Isle of Djerba, from the Tunisian Jewish community. May we all be blessed in this coming week to really fully absorb the blessings that Shavuot brings us. Blessings of the harvest, blessings of the natural world, blessings of the mind, blessings of learning and of acuity, blessings of relational harmony, blessings of having kindness for oneself and kindness for others. Amen. Shabbat Shalom.